Okay, so this is our presentation for Chapter 5 out of the textbook.
And we put our questions at the beginning of our presentation just for something to think about while we're presenting. And so our first question is, how do you think you've developed multicultural competence up to this point? How has your perception of your cultural humility changed since this presentation? And then just to go into a little more detail on that question, cultural humility is an evolutionary process. In other words, the finish line is always moving. You're never truly done. It is a lifelong process of change. Our second question is, why do you think society gives more power to some groups versus others? How does your own culture influence how you perceive minority groups? Are you a member of a minority group? And then our last question is, look at your own culture. How do you identify yourself? Are there any guidelines that you need to work on in order to be a good, multiculturally competent helping professional?
Okay, so to begin with, we're going to introduce the multicultural context. So with the population of the US on the rise due to an increase in diverse people, there are also new challenges we as human services providers need to address. So the US was founded by white people, and the first wave of immigration was from the 1980s to the 1920s due to the opening of Ellis Island, and there's been much immigration since then. So much so that it is projected by 2044 that white people will no longer be the racial majority. One of the largest groups attributing to this is the growing Latinx population. Between 1970 and 2010, the Latinx population has grown by over 41 million people. And by 2050, they will make up nearly a quarter of the population in comparison to the less than 5% that they were in 1970. And the African American population is also projected to double by 2050. Because of the increase of these populations and others, clients and or their families might have difficulty because they have different backgrounds, cultures, and language from the helper. Human service professionals should be culturally competent and be able to provide multicultural counseling. This contribution of this concept is just as important as the psychodynamic, humanistic, and behavioral sides to psychology. And while there have been conflicting ways on how to incorporate this, the most accepted approach is to understand the values, needs, and experiences of minority groups due to it best reflecting our ethical standards. So we're going to just talk real quick about collectivistic versus individualistic cultures. So the US is more so individualistic, and a lot of other cultures are collectivist. So collectivist cultures value group and family goals, and they work together as a team to achieve these goals. So group expectations and values are set in place, therefore individuals should follow these group expectations. So we see within the Arab American and Latinx American cultures, for example, that family is more important than other relationship groups because of that sense of belonging. And so to contrast that, individualistic cultures focus more on individual achievement and rely on autonomy to achieve goals. So again, European Americans look at family as providing basic needs to raise children as independent and self-sufficient, so they will have mastered it as adults. And peers become great influencers during adolescence. However, there are regional differences within the US. And so for an example that I thought was really interesting in the book is that they mentioned Appalachian culture holds collectivist values of with the importance of family and community. So let's move on to the ethical standards for professional practice. So the ethical standards for human service professionals is a guide for understanding and following the multicultural approach, including relating or representing several different cultures. The preamble outlines that we should look for the positive qualities of human beings in all of their diversity, as well as respecting cultural diversity. It also asserts that we do not deny service based on discrimination of age, culture, race, ethnicity, etc. So, what is culture? Well, culture can be defined in the book as institutions, communication, values, religions, genders, sexual orientations, disabilities, thinking, artistic expressions, and social and interpersonal relationships. And because helping in and of itself relies on context, It determines our interactions, relationships, and quality of service. And helpers should be able to identify their own cultures, influences, and at the same time understand their client's culture in order to establish a better relationship.
All right, and speaking on culture, that brings us to the multicultural human services, and it states that there are dimensions of culture which include race, gender, identity, etc., and a client's cultural dimensions influence the helping process. In order to provide the best multicultural human services, the helper must make a goal to understand the client's culture and hold respect for the client and the culture that they have. So number one, as a multicultural helping professional, is to determine the degree to which the client's race, ethnicity, or cultural influences such as their customs, how they influence who the client is. And this knowledge that we gain from listening, it influences all the phases of the helping process. So as you gain a deeper understanding of the client and how their culture forms the basis of who they are, providing multicultural counseling becomes easier.
Right, so now we're going to talk a little bit about race, racism, and ethnicity, since that also ties into the helping process and being more multicultural competent. So race in the book is described as an individual or group's physical characteristics, and this forms categorizations of in-group and out-group members, stereotyping. This is especially prevalent in the political world today, as it designates dominant and non-dominant status. So racism, according to the book, is the belief that racial differences produce an inherent superiority of a particular race based on the idea that race is the primary factor we should be considering, which it's not. So this forms systems of oppression and which limits access to or opportunities to education, services, and medical care, among others. On the other hand, ethnicity refers to individuals who are from a specific geographic area, and this includes a wide range of cultural aspects. They commonly share religious, nationality, group, and personal views, and this could include history, values, and behavior. So the social group that makes up an ethnicity's definition of culture also involves spirituality, language, beliefs, values, art, music, games, knowledge and behavior of families, roles, relationships, child rearing, and etc. Ethnicity and race are now both included on government forms, and while there are only two options for ethnicity, Latinx or not, individuals usually can mark as many races as they wish from the multitude of options.
All right, and that brings us to assimilation and acculturalization. Cultural assimilation is a two-way process whereby both the majority and minority cultures change. This is defined as per the textbook. It is also defined as a process by which a minority group comes to resemble a majority group and assumes their values, beliefs, and behaviors, their customs, if you will. So international immigrants, they often move to improve their lives and the lives of their children. And sometimes this means that they voluntarily adopt the new culture's language, customs, beliefs, values, and by practicing the majority culture and integrating more, they receive more opportunities for economic gain, social gain, and so that's why some international immigrants choose to assimilate within the majority culture. Versus there is acculturalization, and this occurs when the minority culture changes, but they retain some of the cultural markers from their original culture, such as language, food, and customs. So that kind of makes me think about all of the many lovely Mexican restaurants that we have in the United States. That is a form of acculturalization. And so this is often referred to as a merging of cultures. And so with the transfer of values and customs from one group to another, enough of the cultural markers from the minority group are maintained so that they are recognized as a distinctive culture. And clients who experience acculturalization and assimilation also experience stress, and the multiculturally competent human services professional will be sensitive to the experiences of their clients. And that brings us to cultural pluralism, which is where when a member of a specific culture maintains their traditions and beliefs rather than accepting those of the dominant culture. And in maintaining their cultural identities, their beliefs and customs are accepted by the dominant culture. So this is a case where individuals come to the United States, but they don't integrate fully. They completely maintain their culture. They're just in a different geographic location. And so the belief that underlies cultural pluralism is that all cultures have an equal right to exist, a respect for each culture, and a recognition that there are many unique ways of forming and maintaining aspects of culture. So for example, this is like Amish communities. They have their own culture within a majority culture. And so the dominant cultures do not require the non-dominant cultures to conform. And rather than be absorbed by the dominant culture, the non-dominant culture, the minority group, is tolerated and may coexist peacefully.
And so then for the next slide, we focused on power, oppression, and discrimination. And in order for oppression and discrimination to be present, there has to be power as well. As a society, we allow those of different race or those of different culture, race, and ethnicity to have more power over others. This results in hatred and anger for some. And then when looking at the idea of power from a human services viewpoint, it is clear that those with the power are in socioeconomic groups that flourish, while those deemed with less power are in lower socioeconomic groups, which kind of ties back into what we were talking about in class a few weeks ago about the poor versus the rich. And then a few other things that comes out of power would be white privilege, which refers to the benefits of a dominant group, in this case, non-Hispanic whites or Caucasians, who receive the benefits simply because they resemble the people in power in a culture's institutions, where many are Caucasian. We have a self-fulfilling prophecy, and that refers to the adaptation of others' viewpoints. And then internalized oppression refers to the act of including others' viewpoints in your views of self. And those kind of focus more on multicultural competence, which is the idea that those in the human services professions need to be able to desensitize the attitudes of oppression and discrimination in order to properly assist clients of different cultures, races, and ethnicities. And then there is a way to examine your identity and culture to develop multicultural competence, and it can be done in a few steps. It begins with looking at your culture. It's important to consider your geographical area, values, beliefs, traditions that can all come out of that area, religion, spirituality, family orientation, arts, leisure, gender, identity, sexual orientation, age, abilities, and impairments. Those all kind of have an effect on your culture and how your culture views all of those. Another aspect is race, which can include Native American, African American, Hispanic, Caucasian, Asian, Pacific Islander, or bi multiracial. And then the last factor is ethnicity, such as country or continent of origin of one's family and belonging to a social group or religious groups. And then I kind of just thought about my own multicultural competence, and I focused on the fact that I grew up in Maine until I was about 14, and then I moved to Raleigh, North Carolina. And in Maine, the school I went to, there was only one African American student there. And then when I transferred to Raleigh, it was very different. It was more equal, the white versus Black people. And it was just a big culture shock for me switching from Maine to North Carolina. And then my dad's paternal side of the family is from Venezuela. And so he's made sure that his kids, myself and my siblings, are aware of everyone else's culture, and just kind of like wants us to have more of an understanding and accepting and a gratitude to others' cultures, because they can give us what we don't have. And I was also raised Catholic when growing up, but I stopped attending church in my early teenage years. And I feel as if I had continued to go, it would have had more of an impact on me than it does right now. And then you can always, as we said in the beginning, multicultural competence is an ever changing journey. You will never reach the end of it. And some ways to kind of improve on your multicultural competence is you can continue to explore your own culture, self, and identity. You can seek out ways you can continue to learn about other cultures. This could be in speakers, awareness events, talking with friends of different cultures, or etc. You can seek to be influenced by others who may know more about other cultures. You can take the information learned in the textbook and apply it to your everyday life. Be aware when you see oppression and discrimination occurring and speak out if you can and if you feel comfortable with it. Seek supervision when working with cultures that you are not familiar with so as not to offend anybody. Help clients see themselves in positive ways. Ask clients about themselves in order to learn about their experiences and beliefs so you can easier help them with what they are going through. And develop a social justice stance. You're able to advocate for your clients so that they know that they have somebody on their side.